Okay, welcome everybody to Aliens Among Us. I might just wait 1 minute while people arrive, and then we'll get going. Maybe I shouldn't wait too long. I might just get started. It's now almost 2 minutes after the hour. Look, I'm excited that this is to welcome you all to our last webinar, our last Aliens Among Us webinar for the year. This is our best subscribed one so far. We've had over 500 people register for this one, which is pretty amazing. Hopefully everyone who's signed up actually turns up. I'm speaking to you today from Ngunnawal country. I'm in Australia's capital city, and I pay my respects to elders and to acknowledge any Indigenous people on this call, and I just pay tribute to their management of the land before we arrived. We can learn a lot from our Indigenous fellows and ladies. So welcome everybody. While people are still arriving, I'm just going to do a basic introduction because today's webinar is all about, I guess we could say, the Brumby Wars. It's all about feral horses, particularly in Kosciuszko National Park. 2 months ago, I guess by way of background, 2 months ago, the New South Wales Environment Minister announced there was a halt to all shooting of feral animals in Kosciuszko National Park. It was meant to be a 1 week or 2 week pause to review the safety after allegations were put on radio station 2GB. But 5 weeks later, that ban was still in place. And we discovered it was actually applying to all national parks in New South Wales. All ground and aerial operations were suspended, which had big consequences, not just for horses, but for feral deer, feral goats, pigs. Our feral animals were no longer able to be controlled by our pest control operators. So we got onto the case and activated our networks and our supporters. And within 24 hours, the government overturned that ban because I think they were just making excuses not to do something about this really difficult problem of tackling the feral horses in Kosciuszko National Park. So we know the issue is going to heat up again. The New South Wales state election is only 4 months away, or is it 5 months away, the end of March. And we're going to really unpack this issue today with our special guest today is the author of The Brumby Wars, Anthony Sharwood. Anthony's been a key voice for science for many years. He's a pretty top-notch communicator. He's a Walkley Award winner for his sports journalism, but he's now turned his mind to, in his book that it was published a little while ago now, to the horse issue. So we're going to hear from him. Also joining us on the panel is Ambassador Christine Milne. Welcome, Christine. And author and biologist Tim Lowe, who is one of our co-founders, and he wrote the book Feral Future, and it's the reason why the Invasive Species Council was formed back 20 years ago in 2002. I also acknowledge that Richard Swain, our Indigenous ambassador, wasn't able to make it today. He's taking a local school out into the bush and talking to them about culture and country, so he can't join us. But just to get us, before we actually hear directly from our panelists, we're going to show a short video from Professor Jamie Pittock, who's been a constant voice of reason and science on the Kosciuszko horse issue. He represents the Academy of Science on this issue, and he's a professor at the Australian National University. Let's play this short message from Jamie before we get stuck into the full webinar.
G'day, I'm Jamie Pittock. I'm a professor in the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. I want to tell you about a trip I recently took down the Snowy River. I went down the Snowy River on a 5-day expedition led by Richard Swain, the river guide and Invasive Species Council ambassador. We put in at the Snowy River at the junction with the Jacobs River and went downstream for 5 days through what's known as the Biadbo Wilderness in New South Wales, in Kosciuszko National Park, and then into the Tingaringi Wilderness area in Victoria. This is some of the wildest country in southeastern Australia. But even in the heart of this wild area, everywhere we stopped, there was extensive evidence of deer and horse damage. I was really taken aback because these have been some of the wettest 3 years in memory, and the vegetation is really thriving, and these grazing invasive animals, the deer and the horses, have really scattered away from the water and the river and headed up into the hills. Nevertheless, everywhere where we stopped, the country was cut up with horse and deer tracks. There was horse and deer manure everywhere. Unfortunately, on the flatter areas and the wetland areas, there were dust baths and mud baths where the ground had been churned up by deer, by horses, rolling and bathing. Unfortunately, some of these places coincided with Indigenous cultural sites, and there were rock tools and other evidence of Indigenous culture being disturbed by the impact of these feral horses and deer. As a scientist concerned for conservation of flora and fauna, the aspect that really worried me was how systematically some particular species had been eaten out of the environment. It was clear on the river that rushes had been extensively eaten out, and there was only in those rare places that deer and horse couldn't get to that there were large patches of bulrush. When we looked at the wildflowers, plants like the pale vanilla lily or munyang, as it's known by the Yuin, this is a really important bush tucker food. It's got a carrot-like tuber. They were once common, widespread across the river gorge. We could really only see them in places such as rocky hill slopes that the horses and the deer couldn't easily reach. Another major impact that really concerned me was the fate of the kurrajong trees, because it's clear that the horse and the deer were eating all of the small seedlings to extinction. It's a bit sad going through some of these forests in the bottom of the gorges, because you can see that there's a particular kurrajong age class that seems to coincide with the Kosciuszko virus knocking back rabbit numbers, and then before the horse and deer populations exploded, where one generation of kurrajong has got away, has grown tall enough that they won't be grazed to death. But sadly now, what we saw was evidence for virtually every small kurrajong had been eaten to its roots. The only ones that we could see were growing up between crevices in rocks or in the midst of a big fallen tree. What this says to me is that our governments really need to step up. It is really time to control these populations of feral horses and deer. Without that, we risk losing both our natural and cultural heritage.
All right, I think we've just finished the video a little bit early because we're running out of time, but look, what a great way to introduce the issue. It's pretty clear what's going on there. For those who just arrived, I'll just remind you, we've got our special guest, author of the Brumby Wars, Anthony Sharwood. We've got panelists Christine Milne, our Invasive Species Council ambassador. Hello, Christine.
Hi.
And we've got author and biologist Tim Lowe, who was the author of Feral Future. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Right. Well, Anthony, let's start with you. And I mean, this is the book that's your latest book, The Brumby Wars. I've read it. I was captivated. It tells a great story of the people behind this divisive issue. But I wanted to really, start off by hearing from you, Anthony, about how you felt after this latest media coverage where the government banned horse control. We thought we'd got to the point where the horse numbers were starting to be reduced, and suddenly the government flipped. So tell us about how you felt about that.
Thanks, Andrew, and hello, everybody. Look, I felt pissed off. I felt very angry and annoyed, and I'm sure I came across as that in the interview I did on 2GB afterwards. Some of you listened to that, and some of you said it was quite a cut-through interview. I don't think it was a perfect interview, but I called them sooks in that interview, and that blew up in my face a bit on social media, which it was always going to. I don't care. But that is how I felt. I felt that these people will never be happy. They are sooks. I tried to remind people through my social media accounts that, you know, the old deal with the 2016 draft plan that never saw the light of day in Kosciuszko was to get as few as 600 horses. They've got 3,000 or 4,000 under the bloody Barilaro legislation and the plan through it that Keane brought through, Minister Matt Keane in New South Wales when he was Environment Minister. They have 6 times as many horses as they wanted in the last plan. Be happy with that and stop sooking. So that is how I felt. And it was a very, very strong reminder, Andrew, that these people, these Brumby advocates, will never, ever be happy and never stop shifting the goalposts. They will always shift the goalposts to a place that is, to them, insufficient. And we must be mindful of that as environmental advocates, that we are not dealing with rational or reasonable people. We are dealing to some extent with dopes and to some extent with very canny, sneaky, not dopes, but very bad actors. That is a toxic combination of people who we are against here. And I was reminded, to answer your question directly and succinctly now, Andrew, of just how toxic those people are. And as I said, it pissed me the hell off.
Gosh, I love your plain speaking. So, and I'm going to just wind back a bit, because maybe just to help everybody else understand, you're a sports writer, but now you're writing about horses. Tell us about the book you first wrote that introduced you to this subject, From Snow to Ash. The process of writing that story, well, when did you first come to face with the horses?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really good anecdote that illustrates that. So look, I worked in the media for a long time, mostly as a sports writer. I was at Network 10, and at the end of 2019, for one reason or another, I'd had enough. I took off and I walked the Australian Alps walking track, which, as many of you will know, runs from Gippsland to the ACT, roughly 700k, through the entirety of the high country. I happened to do that in the black summer. I happened to start on the day of 60 centimetre summer snowfall, and I ended being evacuated from the Duns Road fire that ended up burning a third of Kosciuszko National Park. I was about 3/4 of the way through the trek. So From Snow to Ash, the title of the book, refers both to the conditions on my walk, but also to the mountains themselves. It's not so much just one of those boring, I did an adventurous thing books. It's actually a book about the Australian Alps, about the changing conditions they face, about the fact that a landscape famed for snow is not able to cope with the increasingly frequent fires for very many reasons. So From Snow to Ash, in a sense, characterizes not just my trip, but the state of the mountains themselves. On that trip, on a very dry day, I came to Kowombat Flat, a very sacred place for Indigenous people. It is the source of the Murray River, or the Indi as it's known in that area. Hadn't rained for a long time. The flat was eaten to an absolute cricket pitch length by all the Brumbies. The source of the Murray, which bubbles out of the ground, was a cesspit. It was poo and mud. It was undrinkable. This was, even though I've walked the Kosciuszko National Park most of my adult and teenage life, this was to me shocking. This was to me a real eye-opener. My first eye-opener to the effects of the Brumbies. I was just like, they have made this water undrinkable. I had walked 16 dry kilometers without any water. It was a pretty desperate situation. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was very uncomfortable. I had to go downstream because I knew that there's a thing called Pilot Creek that rises in good sphagnum bogs that the Brumbies don't go to because it's too rough, just like Jamie Pittock was saying. Fortunately, some areas are too rough for them, so the environment is still protected in those areas. I walked downstream, got some good water there. I was then mocked by Brumby advocate Peter Cochrane. Oh, any good bushman knows you go upstream for water. Yeah, Peter, any good bushman knows that there was no water upstream, but you're actually a fake bushman. You actually just trot around on horses to the same tiny little section of Kosciuszko National Park and are what is colloquially known as a bullshit artist as well as a dope. So that is how I came to the issue. It rammed home and my eyes were open from there. And for the rest of the trek, I started seeing the Brumby damage for the first time. And then I was fortunate enough to have plenty to do with an organisation called the Invasive Species Council, who further opened my mind. Long story short, Andrew, it is possible to be a fan, an advocate, a lover of our Australian high country and other landscapes without quite understanding the damage. So you and we must never stop explaining to people.
Thank you. And I know you love the park. You're a frequent visitor, and I can see the passion in what's now caused you to write 2 books about the area, the Alps, and their plight. Just to remind everybody, this is a Q&A webinar, so we're encouraging your questions. And the way to do it on this Zoom webinar is not through the chat function. You use the Q&A function. You should find it down in the bottom menu, Q&A. And there's already a few questions come in. I think I can see 3. We've got about 200 people actually online, so that's pretty fantastic. I think it's our best followed one so far. So there's lots of interest in this topic. I might just keep sort of unpacking what's happened with this pause on pest control that was put in place in mid-September as a result of complaints about aerial shooting of feral deer, which is sort of a story in itself. But the pause is now lifted. The feral animal control across the state is now reinstated. I might just bring you in, Christine. Just you might want to just talk a bit about when you first heard about it and what your reaction to the government's decision to stop all pest control in Kosciuszko, then the whole state parks.
Well, I think, Andrew, the first thing is it's in the reach of a New South Wales election, and the government panicked under pressure from the backbench and the Nats in particular, and so they overreacted, and it's all about the politics. Absolutely nothing about the park. In fact, not even caring about the horses. This was purely the National Liberal Party deal in New South Wales in the proximity to the election. So I was appalled because I thought, here we go again. This extreme right-wing bunch influenced the vested interest in the National Party, using their agreement with the Libs to once again destroy the environment for their own political purposes. And it's not just about Kosciuszko. This is about, and this is where I totally agree with Anthony, this is about de facto signalling that I'm a Bush nationalist, as Anthony just talked about with regard to one of the people taking those horse tours. It's all about the bush, the beach, beer, Anzac and the flag, and horses in Kosciuszko. Look at me, I'm a Bush nationalist. And that is what the conceptual framework is. And when I heard it, I thought, here they go again. They're just invoking all this for the sake of clickbait, essentially, and for the sake of influence in the elections. So it's pretty appalling as an environmentalist to see what's happening to our wild places at the hands of people who never go there, don't actually care, and see it as a political tool.
Thanks, Christine. Tim, would you concur?
Yeah, no, I think it was quite shocking to see Ray Hadley's exercise of power just to threaten the government and say, if you do not explain to me what has happened, why these horses were shot, these accusations that they'd been shot in the most cruel way, that they'd been bled out, when he posts the photos of the dead horses on the website, they're just cleanly shot horses. There's no evidence of the cruelty or bleeding out that he's complained about. But of course, photos of dead horses, that's just, they press buttons. I mean, people aren't seeing the alternative ways horses die from drought, or the ones that were removed through trapping that ended up in abattoirs and knackeries. I mean, it's just this way you can shine a very narrow spotlight on a dead horse and get a lot of people very emotional, and then threaten to harness that people's emotion against a minister because you hate the kind of green values that underlie the national park. And you know what Christine's saying about bush beaches and beer as an alternative sense of being Australian to one of valuing the native species, which are not as charismatic as horses. I admit that. You know, the little critters up in Kosciuszko, they just can't do what a horse can do in terms of heartstrings. But, you know, it shouldn't be about us. It should be about them.
But there is something that can work as well. Maybe a corroboree frog doesn't, Tim, because it's a slimy little thing and no one's ever seen one in the wild. And maybe a broad-toothed rat doesn't, even though they're absolutely gorgeous things, and I've seen lots of them, because it's called a rat. But native animals, the term native animals is strong. And, you know, I was talking to the consultant, Peter Lewis, today, who's done some work with you, Andrew, and the Invasive Species Council. Many would have seen his articles in The Guardian and his appearances on the Drum and so forth. And he was saying that the term invasive animal doesn't repel people as much as the term native animal really attracts them. So I have come around to the thinking that we don't even have to pick an animal. We don't even have to make it about the frog, the rat, the Guthaga skink, which no one knows what one is. The pygmy possum's getting close. They're pretty cute. But we just have to fight the same culture war they're fighting, but fight it better. They want to talk about our culture. Rightio. We'll talk about our native culture, our Australian culture, and make it. That's where we've got to shift the goalposts back onto turf that suits us.
Yeah, well, I'll just maybe think a bit about the oversized influence the media has. I mean, Christine's probably seen this many times before around how it just takes one offside shock jock and suddenly government flips their policy. At least in this case, we managed to rescue it and our supporters push back, and the federal controls back in, occurring again. But Christine, how does this play out in other issues, not just horses, for example, in Tasmania, where you've seen sort of a very oversized influence from some quarters on deer in Tasmania? What do you think about that?
Well, it all comes back to not so much the influence broadly of people like Ray Hadley and the right-wing media. It's who are they talking to, and how do those people influence the membership as members of the Liberal National Party? How do they then influence the backbench MPs, who then influence the government or the opposition of the day, and also pre-selections? So it never is about, oh, what is the influence of Ray Hadley broadly? It is, what is the influence of Ray Hadley on the marginal seats and places where vulnerable MPs in marginal seats might go down on the pre-selection if the backbench, if the membership, activist membership of that branch are influenced by News Corp and by the right-wing shock jocks. And that's how their power is amplified. It's no coincidence that Sky News is on every television in Parliament houses around the country. Now, why is that? It is because the MPs are constantly having in the background, everyone has, if you've got that monitor on, it's Sky News, and then of course Sky After Dark, because Murdoch took over that entirely in 2016. So you have got MPs feeling vulnerable and the arguments being put by the shock jocks, and then their own members ringing the local members saying, I heard this on the radio and this is what's happening and I won't vote for you in the pre-selection unless you fix this. And so that's the kind of power play that goes on between those shock jocks. Now, Christina Keneally, for example, used to have her office monitor Alan Jones, listen to his questions. 11:30 at night, she would get that answer, send questions to him. That stroked his ego, and he used to get on there and say, isn't it great that her staff are working till 11:30 at night to answer my questions? But essentially they backed off. So it's all about ego and power, and it is just another tool to maintain and grow the right-wing presence in Australia. So that's how they operate. That's how they operate in Tasmania. And it comes again to the culture issue. And this is where it's a shame that Richard, our cultural ambassador, can't be here, Richard Swain, because he puts it that this Bush nationalism, this default Bush nationalism, is actually such an affront to Aboriginal culture. And it is no point saying that we acknowledge we're on Aboriginal country or that we care about Aboriginal culture if we are prepared to destroy country, which is culture, if we're prepared to Aboriginal totems go extinct, because that is what our wildlife represents. So I do think the Tasmanian experience is the post-colonial experience that we're seeing run around with the man from Snowy River stuff in Kosciuszko. We're seeing it here with our minister saying he wants to maintain a quality herd of feral deer because it's the Tasmanian way of life. So that is the culture war that we are fighting.
Yeah, yes, thanks, Christine. I might just throw to Tim for a second, because not only do we have these other agendas running in our opponents, but one of the arguments that is used is the welfare of the horses, and it's not as simple as they make out. Tim, you've been following the horse issue for decades, I suspect. Well, you wrote Feral Future back in 1999, so I'm sure horses were already featuring back then. What can you say about, I guess, the history of this, and noting that this all stemmed from a shooting incident back in 2000?
Yes, I think, for 100 years, the culling of horses, which was mainly happening on pastoral properties, it was going on for 100 years. It wasn't controversial. You had this total flipping now where the pro-horse people are trying to pretend that it's the men on the land, the farmers, who were always the horse lovers and always looked after them, when they were doing the culling for 100 years. And that culling's still going on in the Northern Territory on behalf of pastoralists. But then you get, I think what was really unfortunate was that the cull in Guy Fawkes National Park, that where journalists and helicopters come in and shoot images of these dead horses. It's just come in the same year as the Sydney Olympics open up, with the very first opening scene is horsemen. So here's Australia saying to the world, the first image you will see of us around the world is galloping on horses. And so it just looked hypocritical. And, it was this alternative, this Bushman mystique. But if you go back to Guy Fawkes, so you have the Guy Fawkes River National Park Heritage Horse Association. It forms to make sure there will never be another horse cull in Guy Fawkes. And so there hasn't been. But you can read on the Facebook account, like 2019, really serious drought, the suggestion that in that year, 1,000 horses died of starvation in Guy Fawkes National Park. You can read that on the Facebook account of Guy Fawkes Heritage Source. I mean, what sort of suffering are we talking about? Horses take months to die of starvation. Horrible. Then you can also find that the Guy Fawkes Association, they take horses that are trapped in the park to try and find them homes. But in that year, they were saying, we've got very little feed. We can't hold these horses for very long. Once advertised, horses will be given a week to be sold or they will be sent for slaughter. And so here's the Horse Association that was formed to make sure no horse would ever be shot from the air from a helicopter. And we know that most horses that are shot from the air from helicopters, they die within 1 to 4 seconds. But they're sending them off to slaughterhouses where they're loaded on trucks, totally wild horses, then unloaded, there's blood, the smell of death, they're taken in and shot or bolted. And this is more socially acceptable than culling. It doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. And the irony about Guy Fawkes is after that culling operation in 2000, which left about 100 horses, there's now over 2,000 horses in the park. And I'm sure that the next drought, there'll be lots of suffering. I'm just reminding people there's opportunity to ask questions, and there's a lot of questions coming through. Make sure you put your questions on the Q&A option down the bottom of your page, not the chat function. Really impressed. There's lots of really interesting questions, so some of the panelists might want to just flick through them. But I noticed for in response to what Anthony was saying around, we need to the poor corroboree frog, the little corroboree frog that looks so beautiful. The comments saying, well, we should just try harder at creating some bit of love for these creatures. But Anne, you might want to respond to the welfare question and what you think the contradictory and sort of I guess warped logic of some of the horse advocates that you found in writing your book about the Brumby Wars.
Yeah, I mean, someone also put in the Q&A that a lot of horse lovers are smart enough to understand that horses don't belong in the national park. And these are my favorite people who own and love horses, but get it that horses don't go in certain landscapes. But I think animal welfare is one of the Invasive Species Council's strong suits in its ongoing struggle to reduce Brumby numbers. By the way, I call them Brumbies. That is my way of telling the other side that I at least respect your name for these animals. I think there's a whole debate to be had over whether we call them Brumbies or feral horses. That's one for another day. But look, I think one of what I was saying was, I think one of the strongest assets that we have on our side in ridding these landscapes of horses that do terrible damage is to point out the welfare issues. It's not just in droughts that they look bony and shabby. The ones south of Thredbo look crap all the time. The ones up at Kiandra, which unfortunately the Snowy Mountains highway goes through, tend to look somewhat majestic a lot of the time. There must be good feed, better conditions up there. I don't know. That's a bit of a problem. But a lot of the Brumbies look shocking all the time. We know that their lifespan is half of that of a domesticated horse if they're lucky. We must point out that it is cruel to keep these horses there. And another question that's in the panel there is, how do you feel sort of sitting in the middle with the Animal Justice Party on one side and the Nats on the other side, both advocating for the horses? Because the Animal Justice Party think it's cruel to kill anything. God knows if any of them have swatted a mosquito before. But anyway, we can use the condition of the Brumbies, which is shocking and which is always shocking, to advocate for their humane culling. And it's something we should really push as much as possible.
I really agree with that. And so, like I'm writing another book on invasive species. I'm writing about horses in my chapter on ethics. And I've just jumped from the Guy Fawkes controversy into the 7:30 TV expose of all the race horses that were being sent to Miramis Abattoir in southern Queensland and being treated incredibly cruelly and being bolted for, it's an abattoir, the meat was being sent to for export, and saying, I mean, I didn't mention with Guy Fawkes, in that if you look at their National Parks Horse Management Plan for 2006, it says we will try and capture the horses, give them, sell them off as pets or riding horses. Many, however, were not valued in this way and were sent to the abattoir. And so you've got people getting up saying shooting horses is cruel. Some of them take hours to die.
Yeah.
And the alternative is putting them on trucks and going to this abattoir where there's all this outrage, or they starve to death and take it's suffering of 8 months. I mean, the animal welfare issues are just extraordinary. So yeah, I'm writing this chapter about the ethics of the conservation movement, about how the conservation movement is accused of cruelty. And I'm saying, look at the horse-human relationship in Australia. It has been cruel from start to finish. And the way that, horses carried our explorers through the outback, they helped white people, well, I don't say dispossess Aboriginal people, but I mean, that's the other way you could write it. And the historian, is it Menzies? Ida Menzies, she talks about, sure, you can read about horses in the explorers' journals, about how they ate them and about how the horses starved to death. It's been cruel, cruel, cruel the whole time. So
I
agree
interviewed
with
Isa Menzies, her name is, and she, for the Brumby Wars, because she wrote a PhD thesis on horses in Australian culture. And, she used the word weaponized, and I asked her the direct question. I threw it straight back at her like a good journo. I said, are you saying, Isa Menzies, that horses have been weaponized to further post-colonial culture against what we had before? And she said, absolutely. The horse has been weaponized, which is a really strong word. We've got to start weaponizing certain things as well. And I think one of them is their bad behavior, the bad behavior of Brumby advocates. So again, this is to address another question in the Q&A. And people have said, can you talk a bit about the bad behavior? And the person who asked that, Ian Pulsford, I'm sure he knows about it, but perhaps he wants others to hear about it. But, wow, really, really long story encapsulated in a few seconds. Everything from tires let down to school children of anti-Brumby folk harassed in the playground, to death threats, to actual violence, to you name it. So these people are behaving appallingly to win their little culture war. This is another thing that we can weaponize, to use that word. We must out that behavior more. The approach taken is often to calmly sit back and say, we're not like that, and certainly not to repeat it back. I would never advocate that, but we must out it. We must say, who are these people making death threats to those of us who are just seeking a bit of sensible land management?
I can see Christine nodding. Christine, there's a couple of questions. We should get the banjo and the man in the Snowy River off the $10 note, and we should stop calling the horses Brumbies. What do you think?
Well, I think we should just use the word feral all the time, because people need to know they're not native animals. We need to get rid of, we couldn't shoot Bambi. We couldn't possibly shoot the pony. We have to call them what they are. They're feral animals and they're destructive in the landscape. And so that's why in fact, it reminds me, I went to a feral deer meeting down here in Tasmania, and I called them feral deer. And the Parks Service in Tasmania, actually it wasn't the Parks Service, Land Management Service, said, well, they're not feral, Christine, they are introduced. I said, they're feral. And so we had that question. So it's all this time trying to soften the image, trying to create something more acceptable. Everyone knows what a feral animal is, and we should just, I think, just use the language that best describes them. But I want to come to Anthony's point about calling out the bad behaviour. That threat to firebomb the Parks Office and the direct threats that have occurred are appalling, and yet most people don't realise the people who supposedly love the horses are prepared to blow up the Park Service in the pursuit of what they want to do. That is not care for the environment. That is not care for any animals. That is just symptomatic of the kind of behaviour that is going on and is encouraged, I have to say, by the right-wing shock jocks. So I just think it is important we get out there, and I agree with Anthony's point about the strength of the Invasive Species Council is the science behind our animal welfare. We rely on the science for what is going on with those horses. Many of them are worm infested, they are starving, as Tim has said, they're in poor condition, and I hate to think, as has been said, what will happen after this bumper year this year, when we eventually get to drought with increased numbers, they will die cruel deaths. And that's where animal justice gets it completely wrong. And I'm very pleased to say that the move in the New South Wales Parliament by the Animal Justice Party in the upper house to get an inquiry very recently into this shooting failed. Their rally outside the Parliament failed. Very small, very loud, very aggressive, but failed. Very few people there, no one took any notice. So I think the key here is that Barilaro led the National Party in a very aggressive stand against the Liberals on this issue. Now he's not there. The Liberals have tried to take it back with their management plan, and now that influence is being pushed to one side, and we should encourage that happening.
Thanks, Christine. Well, we might just think about what happens next in New South Wales. I mean, at least we have a management plan for horses for Kosciuszko that has bipartisan support. Now, obviously, we wish the plan was stronger, and we wish this legislation that protects the horses in Kosciuszko is repealed. And Labor have promised that, the opposition, but the government is sticking to the current legislation. So let's try to do what we can with this, the best we can with something we don't like. So, Anthony, I was just going to ask you, we're not, I was in Parliament last week talking to as many politicians as I could in their last sitting week of the New South Wales Parliament. And we were just trying to work out, well, is the actual control program in Kosciuszko for horses started again? We actually are not sure. We know that all the other pest control operations across the state, except for horses, have restarted, thanks to our efforts and our supporters. But there could be a scenario where they're not actually removing horses, or just a very small number. So what does that mean leading up to the election, if this is the government is just really afraid of continuing their ground shooting operations in Kosciuszko, Anthony?
Look, I'll say this. First of all, I've got an eye on the Victorian election. I mean, it appears that Dan Andrews will win, but bad things are going to happen in Victoria. And I'm sure we've got some Victorians in the House today, when the Liberals and our democracy eventually spits out one government and brings in another, for better or worse, whatever your viewpoint is. When the Libs come into Victoria, we have Brumby trouble in Victoria then, because there are advocates there who have cozied up in a big way to certain people who will become members of the House, who will absolutely stop shooting and stop perhaps all control in Victoria. In New South Wales, look, we can only hope that the politicians follow the law till the March election. I mean, the law does mandate that the removal of Brumbies by shooting and trapping continues. So, you know, that for those who don't understand why we don't know, there is secrecy around this issue. And there's secrecy around this issue because of something we touched upon a minute ago about the harassment of parks officials. So it's all very covert. In a way, that doesn't help the parks because it allows the sort of more imaginative / conspiratorial advocates to say something's going on. Nothing's going on. They just don't want to be harassed. They just want to go home at the end of the day and not feel threatened for doing their job. But look, so I'm hopeful, Andrew, that operations do continue. Don't know how much they'll be able to do in the high summer when the park is very heavily used by people. I'm very hopeful the Labor government, that the Labor government wins the March election and that we can move towards a repeal. There are good people there that you've done a lot of work with, people like Kate Washington, who for a while was the Shadow Environment Minister. She's the member for Port Stephens. Don't know if she'll go back into that role, but she's certainly a strong advocate to get rid of Barilaro's stupid, ill-advised ridiculous law, the first law in Australian history that protects a feral species in a national park. So I'm hopeful that in 6 months or 5 months' time, we'll see a totally different landscape. And I'm hopeful that until then, we at least resume some management.
Yeah. Thanks, Ant. Just a reminder, Q&A, put your questions there. You can also vote on people's questions that already come through to upvote them, and they get more likely to get attention. Someone noted that the boldness of the horse advocates putting on Facebook a video about them dismantling the traps of you're designed to trap the horses for rehoming. Well, this is the method that they would prefer, and they're still also disrupting that. It's pretty outrageous. I guess that wasn't a question, it was more of a statement. So there's definitely a lot of views coming forward. I was just going to go to you, Christine, because I mean, this is absolutely political. You mentioned John Barilaro and his influence on the whole shape of things, and he effectively got his way on this. But at least we're getting somewhere. So what should people do? What should people do to really let the government know that they want action? And there is the danger either that another sort of more overt pause might come in. Ray Hadley might jump on the bandwagon again. And we still don't even know whether there's actually serious horse control going on in Kosciuszko. What should the people listening do to really shift the politics, Christine?
Well, the thing they have to do to shift the politics is to use their influence in this election campaign, and we're in it now in New South Wales. We're certainly in it in Victoria with the vote next weekend, to let the candidates know that they support Aboriginal culture, they support country, they support the protection of native animals, and they do not support maintaining feral animals in national parks and protected areas. That's really just a fairly straightforward, simple thing people can do when they speak to candidates, when they speak to elected members standing again, when they speak to anyone in radio, and write to newspapers, social media. All of those things are being monitored to within an inch of their lives at the minute, all the social media, by the political parties who are polling every 2 minutes to try and see what advantage they can get. So be upfront. My issue is I want to see the protection of Australia's country. I want to see the protection of native animals, and I want to get rid of feral horses. And why are you supporting feral animals? And force them to answer that question instead of always us having to defend actually doing something environment. Make them defend what is this false nationalism that they are perpetrating. That is really the fundamental thing you can do in an election campaign. And of course, when you vote, voting, of course, is your opportunity to vote for the political party that will say we'll get rid of feral animals and will support aerial shooting, because that is the most humane way. We have to actually get out there and force people to be upfront and say what they think, instead of running and being afraid of people running around draped in flags and dismantling the traps and drinking beer and saying how much they care about Brumbies when they don't. It's quite clear. When you vote, think about it. There's 100 people on here. Ring up this week your candidate in any seat and say, I want to know where you stand on this, because it's all recorded. Every phone call is recorded in terms of the number and the issue. So if you ring up this week, it will count for something.
Fine words, Christine. Thank you. I'm just looking at the questions, and the one that's got the most votes is a question I might put to Tim and then maybe back to Anthony. From Colin Ingram: why are we accepting any number of horses in Kosciuszko National Park? Why does the environment have to compromise to achieve an outcome? Tim, are we not being ambitious enough on Kosciuszko?
Well, I think we've recognised the limits to our power. I mean, it's just political realities, isn't it? I mean, I've really enjoyed listening to Christine and Anthony, that, you know, the emphasis we have to put on, it's, you know, the culture wars, it's people who want to use opportunities to bash the National Parks Department. Yeah, we we are losing on this issue. I mean, I've looked at so many invasive species issues over the years, and when you think of success rates for the environment movement and getting what it wants, I mean, in terms of horses, a huge amount of effort, some little wins, but the strength of the other side, the power, that the way that Ray Hadley operated with so little ease. I mean, we just don't have the power. And so, and looking at the power structures and understanding these kind of networks of exercise of power, I think that's where it's at, and that's why we have to accept compromise at the moment.
Jim, before I go back to you, Anthony, I might just pick up one of the questions from Mark Merritt, which is quite popular as well, because I think you're probably well positioned to answer, and it probably relates to what you just said. Is it possible feral goats that are very common and actually effectively farmed in Western New South Wales with big vegetation impacts? I guess the question is, why aren't we worrying about those?
Very, very, very good question. I'm very, very worried about them. I guess the reason that horses are getting more attention is that because they're in national parks, the government as the single landholder can operate, whereas with those Western pastoral properties, it would, if you were to try and do something about it, and certainly it should be done, it's a matter of visiting all those pastoral properties one by one. Absentee landholders are very difficult to prosecute. It's because it's such a diffuse land management problem. It is a tragedy that is not getting the focus it deserves.
And what do you say about where we should be heading for Kosciuszko?
Yeah, I mean, look, I just want to draw the canvas really, really broadly, very briefly, before I narrow the net. Couple of questions in there are, not fully understanding this issue, and to touch on Tim's previous answer about the cultural side of things. Tim said we were losing. I'm not sure we're losing. We've had a few wins, but this is a environmental issue like no other. Christine, you would have seen every environmental issue that there is to see in your life's work. There is no other issue like this issue. Normally, it is environment against profit, or environment against tourism, or environment against something involving the dollar, not the heart. This is environmentalism versus the heart versus culture. We live in a time of culture wars, and the people on the right of the culture war feel like they've lost a lot of battles. They feel like they've lost battles over the family and what that constitutes. And you must occasionally venture to their side and see how they feel. You might call them deluded and bigoted. They may well be deluded and bigoted. I happen to think a lot of them are deluded and bigoted, but that is not what's important. What's important is that these people feel a sense of cultural loss of their Australia as they, brackets wrongly perhaps, but as they see it. The Brumby is in Banjo Patterson's poetry. It is in Eileen Mitchell's Silver Brumby series of books. Interestingly, I interviewed Eileen Mitchell's daughter and biographer for the Brumby Wars, and she said, my mother would say there are far too many Brumbies these days, but we must understand that we are fighting a special type of environmental battle here. And I do not have the silver bullet, the magic potion. I do not have the answer, but I do know that part of the solution here lies in understanding what we are dealing with. We are not dealing with rationality. This is oil and water. Oil is the science, water is the emotion. They don't mix well, and we must understand and always be mindful of that. Geez, I could harp on all day about that subject, except I guess my last word would be, Christine, I respect the fact that you say, call them bloody feral horses. They are bloody feral horses. As I said before, I use the word Brumby. Brumby has a romanticism to it. It has Banjo Pattersonism to it. I use it as a small concession. I say to the other side in my use of the word Brumby, this is the thing that you call it, and I'm going to call it that just for you, just so we know we're talking about the same thing. I personally actually believe that by using the word Brumby, we're actually on the same page as the other side. There's a lot of people in the Q&A disagreeing with me on that. I would urge you just to consider the issue, to consider what concession we can make. We shouldn't make many because our environment is irreplaceable and increasingly degraded, but maybe a minor cultural concession, like using the same word that they use, Perhaps it pushes too much of the romanticism to them and gives them too much of an advantage in the debate. It's a debate worth having, but I feel that's a minor concession we can make.
Thanks, Dan. Now, look, I've only got a few minutes left, and there's an amazing amount of questions. I think we've sort of tried to cover most of the topics in that, but I might just throw quickly to each of you, but I might let Christine respond to what Anthony said. But also noting that on the questions coming through quite strongly is this issue around the tension between animal welfare and what is really animal welfare, and some of the antics of the Animal Justice Party, but also the connection to Indigenous culture and that importance. Christine, do you want to respond to what Anthony said?
Yes, I do. First of all, I agree this is a culture war, but we are fighting it with an ever diminishing group of people. 1/3 of Australians now have one parent who's been born overseas. My concern is we are not promoting what country means and what native animals are to a vast number of people who've come here in the last 20 or 30 years. And they will have no connection whatsoever to the Banjo-Patterson, to the Brumby story, but equally they don't have any connection to Australian ecology and probably not very much connection to Aboriginal culture either. So they take no notice of it really for the most part, because they don't go out into the bush much. We're a highly urbanised population. So in my view, instead of continuing this fight with a smaller and smaller group of alienated people, we should be going out to a broader group of people saying, let us introduce you to the country that you're living in, that you've chosen to identify with. This is what we are. This is who we are. These are our plants and animals and our ecosystems. This is how we... please identify with our nation, with what it is. And I feel like they're the people we need to now be advocating with, rather than fighting this rearguard action against the smaller and smaller resentful lot. And it's very much what's playing out with the Republicans in the US, with the far right having taken over them, and what that means. That's why I think we should go broader and go on an advocacy run on nature, as opposed to fighting a rearguard action.
I like it, Christine. Thank you. And Tim?
I agree with you and not with me. That's a very well made point.
Yeah, I mean, I think really pushing this issue of cruelty, that there are real, horses, they don't have any predators in the Australian landscape. People, if you have an animal that doesn't have a predator, that can sound like a paradise, but we know all too clearly that horses, in the absence of predation, they eat out all their food. Have really poor welfare outcomes, and periodic starvation events. That is really, really cruel. Now, the horse lobby's answer to that is to say, we will trap them and give them new homes. The figures out of Kosciuszko Park are saying only 18% of the horses they trap are found homes. The rest are going off to knackeries. That is a worse outcome than aerial culling. I mean, it is. You can't really argue with that. If you lay out the implications of being loaded in a truck, going to a knackery versus being shot from a helicopter. And so just hammering away at these issues of, you're saying it's cruel to shoot a horse, but what is the alternative? Do you want it to starve, or do you want it to be put in a truck and taken to a knackery or an abattoir? You tell me what is cruel and what is kind in that.
And we can't forget the cruelty on the native animals too, Tim.
Oh, it's just so many layers in this, so many levels. It's just, this chapter I'm writing, it is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I can't wait to get out of it.
Well, we have to close now, but I'll give you the last word, and just a very brief word before we wrap up.
I've said enough, Andrew, actually, but thank you for everybody who attended. Thank you for having me on today. I would urge people to, Christine's right, advocacy, not rearguard action is the role. We must never, ever stop educating people about what we stand to lose. And there aren't enough people who understand that.
All right. Well, on that note, thanks so much to our panelists. Ant Sharwood, the author of the Brumby Wars, if I can get it unblurred. Thank you, Ant, for your time. Christine Milne, panelist, our ambassador. Tim Lowe, our co-founder, author, and biologist. Thank you for your time. So that's all we have for today. Really appreciated all you your engagement through the questions and your voting on the questions. There was a really lively input there. We're recording this event. We're going to put it up on our Q&A page on our website. So if you want to share it with your friends, they can watch it as well. We're going to have more of these next year. Haven't decided the topic, but really appreciate you joining us. And we look forward to more of this next year. Thanks, and have a great new year. Bye.
Thank you.